You're not bad at communicating, you were just never believed the first time. And if you really think about it, that changes everything. Because most people assume over-explaining comes from insecurity, or weakness, or anxiety. But that is not actually where it starts. It starts in moments so small you barely remember them. You saying, "That's not what I meant," and someone rolling their eyes. You crying about something painful and being told you were too sensitive. You trying to explain your side of a story while someone older, louder, or more powerful decided who you were before you even finished your sentence. So you learned something terrifying very early in life. You learned that your feelings alone were not enough. Your memory was not enough. Your intentions were not enough. Your no was not enough. Your truth needed evidence. Proof. A defense attorney. A perfectly constructed explanation that could survive cross-examination. And now you're an adult sitting in a relationship writing paragraphs to explain why a 2-word text hurt your feelings. Not because you're dramatic. Because somewhere deep in your nervous system, being misunderstood feels dangerous. You do not over-explain because you love talking. You over-explain because your body still remembers what it felt like to disappear inside conversations where nobody tried to understand you. And the heartbreaking part is, most of the time, you do not even notice you're doing it. You think you're just clarifying. You think you're helping the other person see your heart more accurately. But underneath the words is panic. A quiet panic that says, "Please don't make me feel invisible again." And maybe this is why certain silences destroy you more than they destroy other people. Maybe this is why a delayed response can feel like emotional abandonment. Maybe this is why you replay conversations in your head for hours afterward, searching for the exact sentence that might finally make someone understand what you meant. Because for you, misunderstanding was never just misunderstanding. It was rejection. It was loneliness. It was emotional exile. And once your nervous system links misunderstanding with emotional danger, you stop communicating naturally. You start performing for safety. You start editing yourself in real time. You explain before anyone even asks questions. You apologize while expressing needs. You soften truths that deserve clarity. You rehearse arguments in the shower. You attach disclaimers to your emotions like little survival tools. I know this sounds stupid. Maybe I'm overreacting. I'm not trying to start anything. I just want to explain. And what is so painful is that people often mistake this for emotional intensity. But a lot of the time, it is actually emotional fear. Fear that if you are not perfectly understood, you will not be loved. Stop for a second and think about your last difficult conversation. Did you spend more time trying to explain your feelings than actually feeling safe enough to have them? Because that question changes the entire story. Most over-explainers grew up in environments where reality itself felt unstable. Not always abusive. Sometimes just emotionally dismissive. A parent who always interrupted. A caregiver who made everything about themselves. A family where your emotions were treated like inconveniences instead of information. You would say something hurt you, and somehow the conversation became about why you were wrong for feeling hurt. So your brain adapted. It became hyper-articulate. Hyper-aware. Hyper-responsible for everyone else's interpretation of you. You learned to monitor tone, facial expressions, pauses, body language. You became an expert at emotional translation because deep down you believed one thing: if I can just explain myself clearly enough, maybe I can finally deserve understanding. And this is where it gets darker. Because eventually, you stop trying to be understood. You start trying to become impossible to misunderstand. Which means you over-contextualize everything. You over-justify tiny decisions. You over-own blame. You tell the entire backstory before asking for a simple need. And when someone says, "You don't have to explain yourself," your body almost does not believe them. Because emotionally, you always had to. There is actually a psychological reason this pattern becomes so automatic. Your brain is constantly trying to predict emotional danger before it happens. And if you grew up feeling chronically invalidated, your nervous system learned that conflict could arrive suddenly and without warning. So now, before conversations even happen, your body prepares for disbelief. That preparation becomes over-explaining. Not consciously. Neurologically. Your brain is trying to control the outcome before rejection can happen. Researchers sometimes call this anticipatory self-protection, but emotionally, it feels more like this. If I say everything perfectly, maybe I can avoid being hurt. And that sounds rational until you realize something devastating. No explanation ever feels complete enough. Because the wound was never actually about communication. It was about safety. You can see this most clearly in relationships. Especially romantic ones. Someone asks a simple question like, "Why are you upset?" And suddenly you feel your chest tighten. Not because you do not know the answer. Because your body knows this moment could become a trial, so instead of saying, "I felt ignored," you build an entire emotional presentation. You explain the context. The timeline. The intention. The history. You mention childhood memories. You compare patterns. You clarify your tone 5 different times. And by the end, you are exhausted. Not from the conflict. From trying to earn the right to have feelings. And here is the part nobody talks about. Over-explainers are often incredibly empathetic people. Because when you spend your childhood trying to decode emotional unpredictability, you become highly attuned to others. You know how to notice tiny shifts in energy. You know how to anticipate moods. You know how to make other people feel understood because you know exactly how painful it is not to be. But that empathy often comes with a hidden belief: if I understand everyone else perfectly, maybe they will finally understand me too. Except relationships do not work like emotional transactions. You cannot earn safety through perfect emotional labor. And a lot of anxious attachment is born right there. Not in clinginess. Not in neediness. But in emotional inconsistency. One moment you were comforted. The next moment dismissed. One day your emotions mattered, the next day they were mocked. So your nervous system never learned stable emotional trust. It learned unpredictability. Which means now, as an adult, you do not just seek love. You seek reassurance that love is still there. Constantly. And over-explaining becomes one of the ways you try to secure it. Because if they fully understand you, maybe they will not leave. But think about how heavy that becomes. Imagine carrying every conversation like it determines your emotional survival. Imagine believing one misunderstood text could permanently damage connection. Imagine feeling responsible not only for your feelings, but for whether other people validate them correctly. That is not communication fatigue, that is nervous system exhaustion. And the cruel irony is that over-explaining often creates the exact thing you fear most. Disconnection. Because eventually your words stop sounding like self-expression and start sounding like self-defense. People hear intensity without hearing the wound underneath it. They see paragraphs instead of panic. Explanations instead of fear. And then something terrible happens. You start feeling ashamed for caring so much. Ashamed for needing clarity. Ashamed for wanting reassurance. Ashamed for having emotional reactions at all. So now you are trapped between two fears, the fear of being misunderstood. And the fear of being too much. That tension creates the classic anxious over-explaining spiral. You explain. You feel exposed. You regret explaining. You overthink how you explained. Then you explain your explanation. And suddenly a 5-minute misunderstanding becomes a 3-day emotional autopsy. Everything in your body is trying to solve for safety. But safety cannot be achieved through perfect wording. And somewhere deep down, you already know that. Otherwise, one good explanation would have healed it years ago. Here is something most people never realize until much later in life. Over-explaining is often a form of fawning. Not manipulation. Survival. Fawning happens when your nervous system learns that harmony is safer than authenticity. So instead of simply expressing yourself, you manage other people's reactions to you. You cushion your truth. You make yourself easier to digest. You explain your pain in ways that protect the other person from feeling guilty. You become incredibly skilled at abandoning yourself politely. And because it happens through language, it looks healthy on the surface. You seem emotionally intelligent, self-aware, communicative. But internally, you are terrified, because real honesty would sound simpler, cleaner, sharper. It would sound like, "That hurt me. I need more consistency. I do not agree. I am angry." And if those sentences feel dangerous to say without a long explanation attached, that tells you everything. Your body still associates direct emotional truth with relational risk. This usually starts younger than people think. A child says, "That made me sad." And instead of curiosity, they receive correction. "You're too sensitive. That never happened. You always exaggerate. You're remembering it wrong." What happens next is psychologically profound. The child stops trusting their internal experience. They begin outsourcing reality to other people. So as an adult, before trusting your own feelings, you instinctively look outward. Does this make sense? Am I overreacting? Can someone confirm I'm allowed to feel this? That is why validation feels less like comfort and more like oxygen. And without realizing it, you become trapped in a lifelong courtroom where your emotions are always on trial. You gather evidence. You prepare arguments. You anticipate counterpoints. You over-explain because you are trying to pre-reject the possibility of being invalidated again. But here is the tragedy. Healthy love was never supposed to require a legal defense. The right people may not understand you perfectly every single time. But safe people do something emotionally revolutionary. They stay curious instead of defensive. They ask instead of assume. They do not force you to turn your pain into a thesis paper before they offer compassion. And when you finally experience that kind of emotional safety, something strange happens. Your sentences get shorter. Your breathing changes. You stop rehearsing conversations beforehand. You stop feeling like every emotional moment is life or death. Because your nervous system is finally learning a new possibility. That you can be loved without overperforming understanding. Think about how life-changing that really is. To say, "That hurt my feelings," and not immediately scramble to justify why. To express disappointment without writing 6 paragraphs. To let silence exist without panicking that connection disappeared inside it. For someone who grew up emotionally invalidated, that kind of peace feels almost unreal, but this is where healing actually begins. Not with becoming less emotional. Not with learning to say fewer words. But with realizing your worth was never supposed to depend on your ability to convince people of your humanity. And maybe the deepest shift is this: you stop seeing your over-explaining as weakness. You start seeing it as evidence. Evidence of how hard your younger self worked to survive emotionally confusing environments. Evidence that you adapted intelligently to relationships where being understood was never guaranteed. Your nervous system was not broken. It was trained. That distinction matters. Because what is trained can slowly be retrained. Not through shame. Not through forcing yourself to become colder. But through repeated experiences of emotional safety. Through relationships where clarification is welcomed instead of punished. Through moments where your feelings are met before they are questioned. Through learning that disagreement does not automatically mean abandonment. And maybe most importantly, through learning to believe yourself first. Because healing often starts in one tiny unfamiliar moment. The moment you feel hurt, and instead of building a case for why your hurt is valid, you simply let the feeling exist. No jury. No presentation. No emotional PowerPoint slides. Just honesty. Just your experience. Just the quiet realization that your emotions do not need to become perfectly explainable before they become worthy of care. That is difficult at first. Especially if your entire identity was built around being the reasonable one. The easy one. the self-aware one. But there is a profound difference between communication and self-erasure, and a lot of over-explainers have spent years confusing the two. Real communication does not require abandoning your nervous system to earn closeness. It does not demand that you translate yourself into something endlessly digestible. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can say is the shortest thing. That mattered to me. And then letting it be enough. Not everyone will understand you correctly. That is part of being human. But the people who are emotionally safe will not punish you for that misunderstanding. They will move toward you instead of away from you. And slowly, your body begins to realize something it never learned as a child. You are still lovable, even when you are not perfectly explained. You are still worthy, even when your emotions are inconvenient. You are still real, even when someone else refuses to fully see you. And maybe that is the most healing truth of all. The goal was never to become impossible to misunderstand. The goal is finding the kind of love that does not require you to explain your pain like you are standing in court defending your right to feel it.